nestled in the heart of rural Connecticut. The town of Cheshire was everything one could imagine in a peaceful New England community. Tree-lined streets, charming colonial homes, and friendly neighbors who waved as they passed. It was a place where people still left their doors unlocked at night, where crime was rare and often petty. For decades, Cheshire had been considered one of the safest places to live in the entire state. But beneath its idyllic facade, something sinister was brewing, something that would shatter the town's sense of safety forever. On the evening of June 24, 2007, the weather was warm and the sky clear. The town buzzed with summer energy, riding bikes, backyard barbecues, sizzling with conversation and laughter. In one of Cheshire's most picturesque neighborhoods lived the Hawthorne family. David, a successful doctor, his wife Linda, a former schoolteacher turned volunteer, and their two daughters, Melissa, 14, and Emily, 11. They were the kind of family that embodied suburban perfection, friendly, active in the community, and completely unremarkable in a way that made them trusted and well-liked. That same night, in a part of town less manicured, two strangers sat in a rusted-out sedan outside a closed convenience store. Tyler Vance and Greg Heller were two drifters hardened by years in and out of the system. Both had rap sheets filled with small-time offenses, burglary, drug possession, probation violations. But this time, they weren't looking for a quick grab or a high. This time, they wanted something different, something lasting, something that would give them a sense of control in a world that had never offered them any. Cheshire's local law enforcement was small, but competent. Chief Alan Brody had served the town for over 2 decades and was known for his calm demeanor and thorough, investigative style. But even Brody admitted later, there was nothing in our history that could have prepared us for what happened next. The events leading to the tragedy were set in motion when Vance and Heller, driving aimlessly through town, spotted Linda Hawthorne and her daughters leaving a local ice cream shop. Something about them, perhaps the car they drove, perhaps the way they smiled, caught the men's attention. They followed the family home at a distance, parking 2 blocks away and watching the lights inside the Hawthorne house flicker off one by one. What Cheshire didn't know was that its quiet streets had just become a hunting ground in the early morning hours of June 25th. With the town still asleep under a veil of safety, Vance and Heller made their move. They entered the Hawthorne home through an unlocked basement window, a decision the police would later call a tragic result of routine. The intruders knew the family was inside, asleep, and they had no plans to leave without making a permanent mark. At 7:12 a.m., neighbors noticed smoke coming from the back of the Hawthorne residence. By the time emergency services arrived, it was too late. The house was fully engulfed. What firefighters found inside would not only terrify Cheshire, but also grab national headlines. The bodies of David, Linda, Melissa, and Emily were all recovered from the wreckage. But autopsies revealed something far more horrifying. The fire had not killed them. They had been tortured and murdered beforehand. What was initially believed to be a tragic house fire soon unraveled into one of the most gruesome multiple homicides in Connecticut's history. What shocked everyone even more was the brutality, the deliberate sadism with which the family had been restrained, abused, and finally murdered. And while the town mourned and law enforcement scrambled for answers, Vance and Heller were already crossing the state line, heading for New Jersey, thinking they had gotten away clean, but they hadn't. Within 24 hours, a surveillance camera from a nearby ATM and tire tracks from the wet soil in the Hawthorne's backyard would begin piecing together a chilling trail. The safety bubble around Cheshire had burst, and what lay ahead was a painful journey for justice that would test the town's resolve, its leadership, and its soul. At precisely 3:11 a.m., the silence inside the Hawthorne residence was broken not by an alarm or a scream, but by the soft creak of the basement window being pried open. Tyler Vance, clad in black from head to toe, slithered inside first, his gloved hands landing quietly on the laundry room floor. Behind him came Greg Heller, heavier and more agitated, breathing hard from the short crawl. They had done this before too many times to count. But this wasn't just a robbery. They weren't looking for electronics or quick cash. They had cased this house for something more personal, more permanent. The two intruders paused in the darkness, listening. Upstairs, the house was quiet, too quiet. David Hawthorne, a light sleeper due 2 years in emergency medicine, would normally wake at the slightest sound. But that night, his bedroom door was closed, and the white noise machine on his nightstand covered the faint rustle downstairs. Linda and the girls were in their rooms, unaware of the danger creeping just beneath their feet. Vance and Heller moved methodically. First, they found the circuit breaker in the basement and flipped off all exterior motion lights. Then they made their way up to the first floor. Their weapons were crude but effective: duct tape, zip ties, a hammer, and a pistol, likely stolen. In the kitchen, Heller spotted a family photo pinned to the fridge. David, Linda, Melissa, and Emily, smiling on a recent trip to Cape Cod. Heller chuckled darkly and said, "They look too damn happy." At 3:36 a.m., the first noise upstairs, a creak of the floorboard as David shifted in bed. The men froze, but instead of waking, David simply turned over. Vance signaled Heller it was time. They headed upstairs. They hit David and Linda, room first. It was surgical. Vance tackled David in bed, pinning him while Heller shoved the pistol into Linda's face and barked a warning. David struggled, but the element of surprise and the threat to his wife made him yield. Within minutes, they were bound and gagged, faces pressed into their pillows. Heller moved next to the girls' rooms, snatching them from sleep in a matter of seconds. Melissa fought hardest, biting Heller's hand, but it didn't matter. By 3:52 a.m., the entire family was restrained, lined up in the living room, blindfolded, terrified. What happened next would leave investigators shaken for years. Vance and Heller weren't simply robbers. They wanted to dominate, to humiliate. They took turns interrogating the family about valuables, safe combinations, credit cards, ATM pins. David, still groggy from the ambush, gave up everything. He pleaded for his family's safety. "Take anything you want," he reportedly whispered through the gag. "Just don't hurt them." But this wasn't about things. It was about power. Around 4:30 a.m., Heller forced Linda to accompany him to the bank in the family's SUV. Surveillance footage later confirmed. She withdrew $4,000 while her captor sat beside her, calmly giving instructions. Back at the house, Vance had taken control of the daughters. He separated them from their parents and locked them in a bedroom. Though police never publicly released all the details, the autopsy and statements in court would later confirm the girls were abused in ways too disturbing for broadcast. Meanwhile, Linda returned from the ATM, barely holding herself together. Heller made her write a note to avoid suspicion from the bank. The message read, "Emergency withdrawal, all is well." She was trembling as she signed it, just before sunrise. Something in Vance snapped. Perhaps it was the way Melissa kept staring at him, or maybe it was the sound of a distant siren that triggered panic. Whatever the cause, his next act changed everything. He grabbed the gasoline canister he had spotted earlier in the garage. Methodically, he doused the hallway, living room, and stairs. Heller, eyes wide, shouted, "What the hell are you doing?" But Vance was beyond reason. He struck a match and dropped it. The fire ignited instantly. Linda was still alive when the flames reached her. So were Melissa and Emily. David had already been struck, fatally bludgeoned earlier after attempting to free his hands. The fire, roaring through the home's wooden frame, concealed the evidence, but not the horror. The last thing neighbors heard before the explosion of flames was a high-pitched screamer child's voice. Lost in the rising inferno, Vance and Heller ran out the back door seconds before the fire alarm began blaring. They sprinted across the yard, through the hedges, and into the pre-dawn dark. A neighbor saw two dark shapes moving in the early fog and called 911, but by the time firefighters arrived, the house was a furnace of orange and black dot. What they discovered inside would haunt first responders for the rest of their lives. By the time the first fire truck screeched to a halt in front of the Hawthorne residence, the house had already become a blazing inferno. Flames licked the roofline, and thick plumes of black smoke billowed into the early morning sky. Neighbors gathered at a safe distance, some in robes and pajamas, eyes wide with disbelief. It was a scene so out of place in the quiet town of Cheshire, it felt more like a nightmare than reality. Fire Chief Carl Bender was among the first to arrive. He had known the Hawthorne family for years. David had once treated his son for a broken arm. That memory haunted him as he barked orders to his team. They raced against time, unspooling hoses, hacking at windows, and attacking the flames with powerful streams of water. But the fire had too strong a head start. The gas-fed inferno moved fast, devouring the wooden frame with terrifying speed. It would take nearly 2 hours to fully extinguish. When it was finally safe to enter, investigators and rescue teams donned breathing masks and stepped into the scorched shell. What they found inside would mark a turning point in the case and in the lives of everyone who set foot in that house. The living room was the first area to yield clues. Beneath layers of ash and blackened furniture were signs that this had not been a typical house fire. Melted plastic zip ties fused into the carpet, charred remains of duct tape, a scorched hammer. Investigators quickly realized this wasn't arson to cover a burglary, it was the aftermath of a calculated, prolonged attack. And then they found the bodies. David's was discovered in the hallway near the stairs, his skull fractured, arms still bound. He had tried to escape. There were drag marks near his feet, suggesting he'd been crawling before succumbing to his injuries. Linda's body was found in the kitchen, partially burned, with ligature marks on her wrists. Her hands were raised, as if in a final act of self-defense. The worst discovery came upstairs. In a bedroom at the end of the hall, the remains of Melissa and Emily were found, curled together on the bed. Though the fire had ravaged the room, enough evidence remained to determine that both girls had suffered abuse before the flames reached them. The autopsies would later confirm what the visual evidence already suggested. They had been tortured and then left to die in the fire, unable to escape. The emotional toll on the first responders was immediate and devastating. Some had to step outside and vomit. Others quietly wept as they worked. The silence in the burned-out house was heavy, suffocating, only broken by the hiss of water hitting hot embers. Forensics teams worked methodically, photographing every inch of the scene, bagging fragments of evidence that survived the fire. A partially melted cell phone, a footprint in the soot near the back door, a gasoline canister, warped by the heat but still bearing fingerprints. Every piece told part of the story, but it was the combination of violence and intent that left investigators reeling. The local police department, overwhelmed by the sheer brutality of the scene, called in assistance from the state's major crime squad. Detectives from Hartford and New Haven arrived within hours. Chief Alan Brody stood outside the home, giving a quiet press statement to a gathering of reporters. This was not a random act. This was a deliberate and targeted assault on an innocent family. We will find the people responsible. What made the scene all the more haunting was the juxtaposition: family photos, still clinging to scorched walls, a children's bookshelf in the corner of a blackened room, stuffed animals turned to ash. It was, as one officer described, the worst kind of evil, a total invasion of innocence. Back at the precinct, detectives began piecing together the timeline. The ATM withdrawal at 4:32 a.m. was their first real lead. Linda had been captured on the surveillance camera at a local bank, visibly distressed. Behind her in the driver's seat, the fuzzy image of a man's face, Using bank records and digital timestamps, they confirmed the time and amount withdrawn, $4,000. This confirmed the theory that the intruders had forced her out of the house before the murders. Next came the call from the neighbor who had reported seeing two shadowy figures running through the hedges at sunrise. He'd glimpsed enough to describe one as tall and wiry, the other stockier and limping slightly. That detail would prove important later. But for now, there were no names, no known suspects, just trauma, evidence, and a slowly tightening circle of clues. By sundown, the burned shell of the Hawthorne home was cordoned off with crime scene tape. Reporters camped outside. Grieving friends and community members left flowers and candles by the mailbox. Cheshire, once a portrait of tranquility, had become the epicenter of horror, and for the detectives working inside the precinct, the pressure was mounting. The killers were out there somewhere. They had committed an act so vile, so intimate, that they had to be known by someone. Someone had seen them. Someone had heard them brag. The manhunt had begun, but what they didn't know, yet what haunted them most, was how close the killers had come to getting away clean. As the ashes cooled and the media frenzy surged, the Cheshire Police Department, alongside the state's major crime squad, began sorting through the complex, gruesome tapestry the killers had left behind. Yet in the process of chasing every lead, a painful truth began to surface. Opportunities had been missed. Clues were overlooked, and most damning of all, warnings had come. They simply hadn't been heeded in the first few days after the murders. The investigation focused on forensic evidence, fingerprint lifting, fiber analysis, heat pattern interpretation, DNA residue on zip ties, and surveillance footage. Detectives worked 20-hour days, but despite the massive effort, leads were frustratingly slow to develop. Public pressure mounted as the community demanded answers, but behind closed doors, tension brewed for a different reason. Several law enforcement officials began to suspect the tragedy might have been preventable. The first major oversight came from a 911 call made 2 weeks prior to the murders. A woman in a nearby neighborhood had reported two men loitering near her property late at night. She described them as scruffy, wearing dark clothing, and circling the block slowly in an old, noisy car. The call had been documented, but no officers had been dispatched. At the time, it seemed minor. After all, Cheshire was considered one of the safest towns in Connecticut. Now, with a quadruple homicide on their hands, that description took on chilling clarity. When the woman came forward again after the murders, she was certain the vehicle was the same one later seen fleeing the Hawthorne residence. "I wish I'd pressed harder," she said tearfully during an interview. "I wish they'd listened." Another glaring gap involved a recent burglary just 2 blocks from the Hawthornes. A family had reported a break-in while they were away on vacation. Their home had been rummaged through, but nothing significant was taken, just some documents, photos, and oddly, several articles of women's clothing. The responding officer had marked it as a routine home invasion and closed the case without further review. But weeks later, one of the crime scene investigators found evidence linking that burglary to the same kind of zip ties and duct tape used at the Hawthorne residence. It was the same perpetrators. They had been practicing. Perhaps the most damning oversight was the lack of interagency communication. Tyler Vance had an active warrant in New Jersey and had skipped his last 3 parole check-ins. Greg Heller was listed as a person of interest in a domestic abuse case in Pennsylvania and had reportedly crossed into Connecticut with no fixed address. Their names had not been flagged to local officers due to outdated data-sharing protocols between state systems. The Cheshire police were unaware that 2 dangerous men had entered their jurisdiction. Weeks before the crime, the town had been vulnerable, and no one knew it. Back at the scene, detectives re-reviewed ATM footage of Linda Hawthorne's forced bank withdrawal. They enhanced the blurry face of the man beside her, using facial recognition software and databases from surrounding states. They identified Tyler Vance. He had a long history: armed robbery, assault, kidnapping. His last known address was a halfway house in Newark, New Jersey. He had absconded 3 months earlier and hadn't been seen since, with Vance identified. It didn't take long to trace his known associates. One name stood out: Greg Heller, an ex-cellmate with a violent history. Surveillance footage from a gas station showed both men filling up the Hawthorne's stolen SUV just hours after the murders. A receipt timestamp confirmed the timeline. Had left a trail, just not one the police had followed quickly enough. Meanwhile, a search of pawn shops and small motels yielded more clues. Vance had tried to pawn a watch engraved with the initials D.H. David Hawthorne. A motel clerk in Trenton remembered 2 men checking in and paying cash the day after the murders. When shown their photos, the clerk confirmed it. They looked rough, he said, like they hadn't slept in days. One of them had burns on his arms. But the most painful realization came during a quiet meeting between Chief Brody and members of the crime squad. They laid out a timeline of all reported suspicious activity in the area over the last 30 days: break-ins, prowler sightings, and minor disturbances. The pattern was undeniable. Vance and Heller had been stalking the area for weeks, likely selecting their target with deliberate intent. The Hawthornes hadn't been random. They had been chosen. Police missed the warning signs because they didn't fit the town's narrative. Cheshire wasn't supposed to be a place where monsters lurked, but they had, in plain sight. As news of these missed opportunities began to leak to the press, the backlash was swift. Editorials criticized the police force for its complacency. Community members held vigils, but also protests, demanding better communication, more funding, and a complete review of procedures. Chief Brody faced the cameras in a somber press conference. "We failed the Hawthornes," he admitted. "We failed this town, but we will not fail in bringing these men to justice." The chase was on. But for Cheshire, the damage had already been done. 800 words 6 weeks after the murders that left the Hawthorne family dead and Cheshire forever scarred. Tyler Vance and Greg Heller were captured just outside Buffalo, New York. They had been hiding in a dilapidated cabin, surviving off gas, station snacks, and paranoia. When the U.S. Marshals surrounded the building in the early morning hours, there was no shootout, no dramatic final stand. Vance walked out with his hands raised. Heller was found cowering in the bathtub, weeping. The arrest sparked a wave of both relief and outrage. Relief that the killers were caught. Outrage that they had survived what their victims hadn't. As the news spread, crowds gathered at the police precinct back in Cheshire, some cheering, others simply staring in grim silence. The faces of Melissa and Emily, now etched in every local memory, seemed to haunt the very air around them. The extradition process was swift. Both men were returned to Connecticut under heavy guard. The charges were staggering: 4 counts of murder, multiple counts of kidnapping, sexual assault, arson, burglary, and conspiracy. Prosecutors announced their intent to seek the death penalty, igniting fierce public debate. Connecticut hadn't executed anyone in years, and anti-death penalty activists argued that life in prison without parole was more just. But many disagreed. Passionately, District Attorney Carla Mendel led the prosecution. Calm, meticulous, and relentless. She had spent weeks building an airtight case. Her strategy was to let the evidence speak for itself, and there was plenty of it. Fingerprints on the gasoline canister, DNA on the duct tape, surveillance footage of the ATM and gas station, witnesses who had seen the suspects in town before and after the murders. It was overwhelming. But what made the trial so gut-wrenching wasn't just the evidence. It was the testimony. Linda Hawthorne's sister took the stand and described the agony of identifying her family's remains. Melissa's best friend, only 14, recounted their final phone call that night, how Melissa had said, "I'll call you in the morning." That call never came. Then came the forensic experts. Fire investigators demonstrated how the blaze was started, using gasoline and a simple match. A pathologist explained the injuries each victim sustained: the burns, the blunt force trauma, the bruises around their wrists and ankles. One juror later admitted he had to excuse himself from the courtroom to throw up. But perhaps the most chilling moment came when a psychological profiler took the stand and described the likely motive: thrill, power, a need to dominate and destroy. They didn't just want to rob the Hawthornes, the expert said. They wanted to own them, even in death. The defense, led by public defenders, assigned by the state, attempted a fractured strategy: mental illness, substance abuse, childhood trauma. They painted Vance and Heller as victims of broken systems: foster homes, abuse, addiction. But the jury didn't buy it. The evidence of planning, stalking, and sadistic behavior was too strong. This wasn't a crime of desperation. It was a performance of cruelty. Public reaction was intense. Outside the courthouse, protests erupted daily, some demanding swift justice, others decrying the death penalty. News outlets ran endless segments dissecting every detail. Talk shows debated whether such evil was born or made. The town of Cheshire, once unknown to most Americans, had become a symbol of shattered innocence. After 6 grueling weeks, the jury retired to deliberate. It took them less than 5 hours to return with a verdict: guilty on all counts. When the judge read the decision, there was no emotion from the defendants. Vance stared straight ahead. Heller looked at the floor. No remorse, no apology. But it wasn't over yet. The sentencing phase began shortly after. Here, prosecutors presented aggravating factors: the torture, the age of the victims, the premeditation, the arson. The defense countered with mitigating factors again: childhood trauma, low IQ, and addiction. But nothing could dull the horror of what had been done. In the final statements, Mendel turned to the jury and said, "We're not here because they stole money. We're here because they destroyed a family, a town, and the belief that home is a safe place." On the final day, the jury sentenced both men to death. Gasps echoed through the courtroom. Outside, people embraced, cried, or simply stood silent. For some, it was closure. For others, it felt hollow. No sentence could bring the Hawthornes back. But justice, at least on paper, had been served. Years later, debates over the death penalty in Connecticut would lead to its abolition. But both Vance and Heller, already on death row, remained incarcerated under special provisions. Their execution dates were never set. As of today, they sit in solitary confinement, their names rarely mentioned anymore, their infamy locked away with them. But for Cheshire, the scars never fully healed. The Hawthorne home was eventually demolished. In its place stands a small memorial garden, with 4 plaques and a bench. The inscription reads, "To the family, who taught us what we must never forget, that safety is precious, and evil can wear any face." The trial was over. The killers were behind bars, sentenced to spend the rest of their lives in prison. But for the town of Cheshire, the echoes of the murders would resonate for decades. Healing was slow, complicated by grief, anger, and an enduring sense of vulnerability that had never existed before. The Cheshire Murders had changed everything. In the weeks following the trial, community leaders scrambled to respond. Churches and local organizations set up grief counseling and support groups. The school district hired trauma specialists to help students cope with the loss of Melissa and Emily, two beloved classmates, whose empty desks were a constant reminder of tragedy. Parents debated curfews and safety measures, some even installing security cameras for the first time. The atmosphere, once warm and trusting, grew tense and wary. Mayor Susan Calder launched an initiative called Safe Cheshire, aimed at upgrading police training, increasing patrols, and improving communication between departments. The town council approved a budget increase for the police force and installed a state-of-the-art surveillance system in key neighborhoods, It was a dramatic shift from the town's former belief that crime was a distant problem. Despite these efforts, the trauma left invisible scars. Some residents moved away, unable to live with the memories. Others stayed but found themselves looking over their shoulders, questioning every sound in the night. The local newspaper published letters from residents struggling with insomnia and anxiety. One woman wrote, "I never thought I'd fear my own home." The Hawthorne family's surviving relatives kept a low profile, retreating from public view to grieve in private. Linda's sister became a vocal advocate for victims' rights, speaking at conferences about the importance of early intervention and community awareness. She emphasized how small signs like the ignored 911 call could prevent such horrors. "If only someone had listened," she said in a tearful interview, "maybe my sister and nieces would still be here." Over the years, police continued investigating the killer's backgrounds. Tyler Vance's childhood was marked by abuse and neglect, cycles of foster care, and brushes with the law from a young age. Greg Heller had a history of violent behavior and addiction. While these facts provided context, they never justified the cruelty of their crimes. New legislation was proposed, statewide, to improve data sharing among law enforcement agencies and to increase funding for mental health programs targeting at-risk youth. Cheshire became a case study in law enforcement schools, a tragic lesson in the cost of complacency. But the case also raised difficult questions with no clear answers. Why had Vance and Heller targeted the Hawthornes? Was it random chance, or had the family unknowingly crossed paths with dangerous people before? Were there missed chances to intervene in their troubled lives before they turned to violence? The community wrestled with these questions in the quiet moments, knowing that some truths might never come to light. As time passed, the physical reminders faded. The Hawthorne house was replaced with a small park and memorial garden. Annual vigils were held, attended by friends, neighbors, and strangers touched by the story. School children learned about the tragedy as part of community history, a somber lesson about the fragility of safety. In media, the case became a subject for true crime podcasts, documentaries, and books. But the families always reminded producers and journalists to handle the story with respect and care. These were real people, Linda's sister said, not just headlines. Today, Cheshire is different, more cautious, more aware, but also more connected. The tragedy galvanized the town to come together, to look out for each other in ways they hadn't before. Neighborhood watch programs flourished. Community events focused on unity and healing. The legacy of the Cheshire Murders is a complicated one, a story of devastating loss, systemic failure, and ultimately, resilience. It serves as a reminder that evil can hide anywhere, even in the safest places, and that vigilance and compassion must never waver. Though the Hawthornes are gone, their memory lives on, not just in plaques and gardens, but in the hearts of a town determined to never forget, to never let such darkness take hold again.